Hi, this is Randal Schwartz, host of FLOSS Weekly. This week, Dan Lynch joins me. We're going to be talking about CockroachDB, a SQL-based, horizontally scalable database. You're not going to want to miss this, so stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is FLOSS Weekly with Randal Schwartz and Dan Lynch, episode 546, recorded September 11th, 2019, CockroachDB.
This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Worldwide Technology. Worldwide Technology's Advanced Technology Center is like no other testing and research lab, with more than $500 million of equipment, and it's virtual, so you can access it 24/7. To learn more and get insights into all that it offers, go to wwt.com/twit. And by NetScout. Meeting the digital demands of today starts with a bold, new IT strategy. NetScout is delivering a new perspective, visibility without borders, to guide your digital success and data center transformation. Get seamless visibility and monitoring for performance and security. See how at netscout.com.
It's time for FLOSS Weekly, the show about free, libre, open source software. I'm your host, Randal Schwartz, Merlin at stonehenge.com, bringing you each week the movers, the shakers, the big projects, little projects, projects you may be using every day and totally unaware of it, projects you may want to download right after this show and play with. I think today is going to be one of those. Joining me once again is my lovely and talented co-host, Dan Lynch. Dan, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Randal, it's good to be back.
Yeah, we're going to be seeing quite a bit of you. Is this like the second show in a row already? And then you got one next time?
Yeah, it was only a couple of weeks ago I was here, and then I had a week off. Now I'm back next week as well. So yeah, you're keeping me busy. I don't mind though. It's good. It's good to be. Yeah, it's good to be useful.
It's good to be on the mic. It's always kind of good to be a mic. And are you in a different location than you normally are?
I'm not. I'm actually in the same location, but the angle is slightly different because I've moved my camera. That was a little trick that I've played on you there. Yeah, so I'm in my home studio near Liverpool in the northwest of the UK still. I just experimenting with a slightly more stable camera stand.
Yeah, I understand there was a famous musical group that came from near where you are, the Randals, was it?
The Beach Boys, yeah. You may have heard of them. We've got lots of beaches around here, but just on the banks of the Mersey, some beaches, the Beach Boys were there. Very famous.
Yeah, okay. Lots of bands came from there. Well, I am still in, like last week, I'm still in my Tijuana kitchen set, we call it. I'm heading home on Monday, so I'll be doing it with the Big Blue Yeti on Wednesday coming up when I'm talking to you again. So we have a very interesting project today. I was approached a few weeks ago, actually, to do this show. It's called CockroachDB. I'm going to have to ask them where they got the name, because that's a really odd name for a project. But basically, let me read the first paragraph of their fact, because it's really cool. It's a distributed SQL database, which always scares me a bit, built on transactional and strongly consistent key value store, and it scales horizontally, survives disk, machine, rack, and even data center failures with minimal latency disruption and no manual intervention. It supports strongly consistent ACID transactions and provides familiar SQL API for structuring, manipulating, and querying data. And it's inspired by Google's Spanner and F1 technologies. And the source code, of course, is freely available, or they wouldn't be on this show. This looks fascinating to me because you've had to trade off before this whether you want, replication horizontally, or you could use SQL-based solutions, but you had to deal with issues like master-slave or master-master or all that stuff. Mm-hmm. All of those are hard problems to solve, but it looks like these guys, maybe, like it says, inspired by Google Spanner, which sort of does this as well. It looks like this should be pretty interesting. So back to my notes. Come on, there we go. So we're going to bring on Spencer Kimball in a few minutes, and he's the co-founder and CEO of Cockroach Labs. And so he's going to have a lot to say about this, and we can guess all day what this is about, but I think it's much easier for me to just be curious and ask him things, and then he'll answer those, and that will make me curious about even more of it. So that's the usual strategy I used for doing that. I usually don't do much prep for two reasons. One, I want to be a proxy for the home audience. I want to kind of ask the same questions that they're likely to ask. And if I already knew the answer, that I might not ask that question. And second is, I don't have a lot of time to prep. So I cheat and I read a few things, and then hopefully that's enough to go with. What do you know about this so far, Dan?
I've just been having a look at it today. Much like you, Randall, I take the method acting approach of actually not knowing too much about the project, so I can be like a method actor proxy for the audience. But really interesting stuff. I am interested in the fact that they've chosen SQL as the interface, and then it's a key value store underneath. Because as you said, that's something that kind of you had to kind of pick one or the other in the past, and a lot of people know SQL. Obviously, it's been around for so long, but it comes with its downsides. So it'd be interesting to see how this can overcome those.
Yeah, and it's funny also because their FAQ mentions both the CAP theorem, which is what typical distributed databases talk about, especially key value stores, and ACID. It's like, I don't normally see a project that talks both about CAP and ACID together. So this will be a fascinating technology to pursue. And now before we get started, Dan has a very important message for us.
Yes, this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Worldwide Technology. WWT began building their Advanced Technology Center 10 years ago, and it has grown exponentially. The lab contains more than $500 million in equipment. It's like no other testing and research lab. WWT is a trusted partner who stays with you over the years. Many of their customers have been with them for over a decade because they know WWT is where they can go to get the answers they need to make sure their business runs right. Their ATC is an incubator for IT innovation. Hundreds of on-demand and schedulable labs representing the newest advances in multi-cloud architecture, security, networking, primary and secondary storage, data analytics and AI, DevOps, and so much more. Learn about the products before you launch. WWT's engineers use these environments to quickly spin up proofs of concept and pilots using the sandbox so customers can confidently select the best solutions. In many cases, this reduces concept time from months to weeks, which increases speed to market. They offer Lab as a Service, a dedicated lab space within ATC. Here, customers can perform programmatic testing using the vast technology ecosystem that WWT has already built. It's virtual, so you can take full advantage of ATC's unique benefits anywhere in the world, 24/7. WWT engineers work in these labs every day, beta testing new equipment and building reference architectures and custom integrations to help their customers make decisions and see results faster, and with much less investment. The time is finally here. WWT has launched their new digital platform encompassing the ATC ecosystem. This ecosystem creates a multiplier effect of knowledge, speed, and agility, anytime, anywhere, around the world for their customers. Get access to articles, case studies, hands-on labs, and other tools that make the difference in today's fast-paced world. To learn more about Worldwide Technology and join the ATC ecosystem, go to wwt.com/twit and create an account today. WWT simplifies the complex. That's wwt.com/twit. WWT, delivering business and technology outcomes around the world. And now, back to Randall.
Let's go ahead and bring on our guest. That'll be Spencer Kimball. Spencer, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
Great. And where are you speaking to us from?
We're based in New York. I've been living here 16 years.
Wow. I've only visited there. I worked 1 week a month for, I think, Lehman Brothers. So that was a while. I think that did that for about 4 or 5 years. Learned all the subways and stuff like that. So that was pretty cool. So give us the 30,000-foot view. What problem are people trying to solve when they reach for CockroachDB?
Well, there's two big differentiators and maybe a third that's worth mentioning. The biggest, and this is what we see most of our customers looking for, is the business continuity. People want to be able to survive not just a disk dying or a machine dying, but whole data centers going away and even whole cloud vendors, which happens sometimes. The second, which is worth mentioning, and it's probably about 30% of our customers, Cockroach is actually, because it's distributed, and in fact it's geo-distributed across facilities, it can actually distribute across continents as well. And that's a whole different problem. And that's really, you may have customers in the EU and in the United States, and you want one data architecture to support them all for your product or service. Cockroach is the only database that handles that. And then the third, which is quite important as well, but I don't think it's quite as common as the first two I mentioned, is scale. So traditionally, relational databases like Oracle, they can scale. You can give them, more and more hardware. It's probably a super linear cost curve, and there's a hard limit on how big it gets. Cockroach is a horizontally scalable architecture, and can theoretically scale to exabytes.
Biggest app? What's the biggest installation that you're aware of so far?
I believe there's a company that's pushing to 500 nodes now.
Wow. Okay, now I got to ask the obvious question. Why the name Cockroach?
Yeah. So when we chose the name, or I chose the name, it was really just a manifesto. And I'd been working at Google for 10 years. And when I left Google, the open source ecosystem for databases didn't seem as advanced as what Google had. And out of frustration, I took a couple days and created a sort of design of what would be the ultimate database architecture that would be open source, of course, but would follow all of the learnings at Google over the last 10 years. And sort of what occurred to me is, well, this continuity, this ability to lose a data center and have complete business continuity, that was a critical component. And the best way to build this architecture would be a shared nothing, sort of symmetric nodes, all of which are sort of greedily optimizing, but in, sort of emergent property is that, everything worked well together. And cockroaches are pretty effective, in concert. Essentially they replicate, they're hard to kill, survive. So the name sort of fit. And sort of as an aside, I have a history of dark names. Cockroach is, I have two co-founders. One of them's Peter Mattis, and the two of us wrote the GIMP when we were at UC Berkeley back in the early 90s. Mm-hmm. So that was also a funny name, and I guess we like slightly dark ones. But these days I spend a non-trivial amount of time explaining the name to Fortune 500 executives. So I wasn't expecting that. This is sort of an off-topic thing then. So if you wrote the GIMP, I've been wanting to get them on the show for years. Would you be a person to come back and talk about that, or do you have somebody that's current on that project that I could contact? Oh, we are so far from the project. I could certainly talk about the genesis of it, but I'd be happy to. But the modern iterations of the GIMP far exceed the work we did. We worked on it from '93 when we started it to '97 when we graduated and kind of went on to other things. Okay, that's enough off topic for that. Anyway, so. So this looks like a normal SQL server. Can I connect to any node that I want to and have exactly the same results? Yeah, that's definitely the goal. It's not always the case that a node you connect to is going to be the lowest latency response you're going to get, but every single node you connect to uniformly will give you the exact same answer consistently. And that's a very critical guarantee that the database has to serve for things to work well. Okay, and and I see somewhere in one of the things is something about using Postgres protocol. Is that also for the client? Yes, it is. And we chose Postgres because the SQL ecosystem has been around for 40 years. Postgres has been around for 20. It's very well adopted. And the thing about SQL, and the reason that we chose that as the sort of the API for developers, is that there's a big ecosystem of tools around it. And many of those work with Postgres. So having compatibility with Postgres allowed us to create a better migration path for a lot of users and sort of tool chains out there. And ultimately, you have to bank on how much institutional sort of muscle memory and capacity and capability and existing high value use cases already built in SQL. And so that very early for us, became a decision point. Are we going to be just, a NoSQL scalable architecture that has transactions, or are we going to go the full SQL compatibility route? And what we decided, based on market research, is that the size of the SQL relational database market, I think it's like 50 billion a year, is one of the biggest markets in tech. That seemed like the right TAM to attack, as opposed to kind of creating our own API like a MongoDB or Cassandra or an HBase, where you're asking a lot more from big companies, because you're saying, hey, this may be a great system with great properties, but we're going to ask you to migrate to something completely new that your developers are going to have to use that doesn't have a pre-existing ecosystem of tools.
And how much of something like Postgres have you implemented inside, or is it using Postgres and then that's talking to the key value store?
We weren't able to use Postgres. Cockroach is written in Go. So there's a couple of reasons we weren't able to use Postgres. That was one of them. You might have been able to do something with it, but ultimately, if you have a distributed architecture, you have to realize that Postgres itself is not cognizant of that there are different nodes, and in fact that there could be geographic latencies between those nodes. And if you want a distributed SQL architecture to work well, the optimizer, right, that plans out how a query is going to be executed, both sort of logically and then physically, has to be aware of the reality, the physical reality of where the data is stored, and be able to choose between those in order to optimize those plans. And that's sort of an end-to-end project, and it's we're still working on it 5 years into the project, and there's plenty of work to do. So just using Postgres would never have allowed us to realize the real benefits and capabilities. That also means that we have, to answer your first question, a big hill to climb, a big mountain, in fact, to climb, because Postgres has been around for 20 years and there's a heck of a lot of extensions and things in it. And our goal is not to implement every single thing that Postgres has, but to make sure that if you're using, the bulk of the sort of standard SQL interface, that it all works perfectly. And we only asymptotically approach that goal. We've added things like JSON columns and JSON indexes, but even those are slightly different in some ways, because we do have to deal with the fact that there is a distributed, in fact, a geo-distributed reality underneath. So there are some differences, but we try to be as close as we can to compatibility, for just to help our users migrate and use the familiar tools that they need to get their work done.
Do you ever run the Postgres test, even though a lot of it's going to fail, just to see that you're doing things similarly?
Well, we don't run the Postgres tests directly, but we do run many of the ORM test suites. For example, Hibernate. Right? So that's one of the more commonly used ones for Java developers, and we run those because they're quite extensive. The Hibernate tests that are specifically targeted at Postgres, they run very well against Cockroach now. There's still some work to do, but I believe something like mid-90s% of the tests run correctly, and then the ones that don't are using features that we don't yet support that Postgres does support.
Just a second ago, but I was interested in, when I was looking through the documentation and stuff, that you couldn't, you can replicate a database across two machines in the same rack or two racks in the same data center, but then also you get up to the stage where you could have it across continents and so on. And you mentioned that you can't get around the realities of where the data physically is. Does it create a performance problem if you have, say, a database replicated one part in, say, North America and the other part in Europe? Is that going to create a network latency thing that you can't really work around?
Yeah, absolutely, it does. And it's both a challenge and an opportunity. And I can get into that a little bit. I'll try to keep it brief. The benefit of having geographically distributed replicas is that you have non-correlated failure domains, right? If everything's on the same computer and that node dies because it loses power or whatever, your database is gone. So you spread them between racks. But then the problem is that racks have a single, usually, a single, power, source and networking source. And so that can fail, and then all of your data is gone. So you go between racks, and then, of course, you go between facilities, but maybe you put them very close together, say on the East Coast, 3 availability zones in AWS. And that's good, but you still have correlated failure domains, right? A hurricane could hit that region. Those facilities are usually right next to each other. Or you could have someone with a backhoe take out a fiber optic cable that's feeding the whole thing. That forms a network backbone. And the further you go afield in terms of geographic disparity, the better your reliability is going to be. But of course, the further you go, the higher your latency is, right? So there's a fundamental trade-off in there. But what's really interesting is that any startup these days that puts an app in the App Store has the ability to reach users in Turkey or Brazil or in Japan, and you don't really know where those users are going to pop up. But what you do know is that you have fundamental limitations around the speed of light, and in the architectures that some 90% of the world's businesses currently use, you fundamentally are going to send all of those users to one data center, right? And that's going to be in Virginia, or it's going to be wherever it is, Ohio. And that's not a very good experience either, especially when you have the ability now with things like LTE and, of course, 5G coming to deliver what feels like instantaneous user experiences, which are very important for things like AR and VR and interactive media and gaming and self-driving cars and things like that. You fundamentally are not going to be able to serve international customer bases with that old architecture. Cockroach, even though, yes, we are dealing with geographic latencies, opens up a whole new world of possibilities where you're actually able to say, okay, this isn't a European user. We're going to domicile their data in the EU. This is a US user. We're going to domicile their data in the US. We're going to replicate the data in each of those places. But we don't want a European user's data spread all over the globe. We want it to be in Europe, even for GDPR, for example, but also for latency. And that's where you're actually able to say, okay, Cockroach can provide a global, like a planetary database, and partition the data for the users appropriately so that it's in their legal jurisdiction and that it's very fast for them to access. But because it's all one holistic cluster, it's one database that the global service is built on, that actually allows you to build applications where a US user and an EU user can interact in some way. That's important. Right? Maybe it's a gaming platform is a good example where there's clear interactions, but also just in any kind of system you have, users move, right? They go on vacation, they may temporarily relocate for some period of time. You want their data to follow them. You want that sort of flexibility and mobility of data. And those are all things that are possible with Cockroach. So it turns out if you do things intelligently, even though you have to wrestle with the fact that there's a speed of light problem, right? You actually can make things faster. You can actually deliver less than 100 millisecond user experiences to everyone on the planet if you design your data architecture appropriately with a technology like Cockroach. So, in fact, you can get better latencies.
That's really interesting, actually, because you're right. I never really thought of that, but it's so obvious when you think about it that it cuts both ways. So you might be better off having some of the data nearer to, as you mentioned, I don't know, we picked Turkey out of the ether for whatever reason, but say you've got a customer base in Turkey, you might be better having some of that data nearer to them than in a data center further away. It might be faster for them. That's a really interesting bonus of this kind of architecture, I suppose. And I was interested, you mentioned the legal side of it, and don't worry, I know you're not necessarily a lawyer or anything, so I'm not going to ask you for any serious legal advice. But I was interested in that. You were saying that you could have some of the data kind of located in one jurisdiction and some in the other. Do people do that deliberately? Have you had any customers ask for that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's there's different reasons for it. Some of it actually comes down to regulations where compliance is important, and you see that more and more. But I think just fundamentally it comes down to user preference, and also of course mixed with the use case. But there's some countries like Russia and China right now that have pretty strict laws about how the data is domiciled, and it must be in those countries and only in those countries. Vietnam, as an example, requires one copy of the data to be resident in Vietnam. South Korea, for certain kinds of use cases, has to all be in South Korea. Switzerland and Germany are more, a bit more restrictive than other countries in the EU. South America is all following the EU pattern. So it's quite a minefield and creates a lot of liability for business. So you do need a foundational system that can, flexibly solve the problem in a way that makes sense. And I mentioned customer preference, and this is really important too. If you think about, many of our customers are SaaS businesses, right? It's a company whose end customer is another business, and those businesses you're often storing data about their customers, about their employees, whatever it is. They usually have a strong preference, like a strong preference that the data and the processing of that data happens in their legal jurisdiction. And yes, you can say, you can always, in almost all of these data sovereignty regulations, you can get the consent of the end customer to process or to domicile the data in a different locality that has different regulations. But that doesn't mean that you as a business are going to do as well versus a local competitor that can actually assure the end customer that their data is going to be processed in their legal jurisdiction. So, it just, there's these different levels that people care about. And in the end, you're going to lose against a competitor that can, provide more assurance about data privacy.
Yeah, I mean that's obviously a huge concern for a lot of companies, especially in the enterprise kind of sector. So I was curious about why you chose to develop this. It's under the Apache 2 license, I believe. So what made you decide to use that license and develop in an open source way?
Well, open source, to my mind, is the only solution, especially for a database in this day and age. There's a lot of good databases out there that are open source, so I wouldn't touch something that was closed source with a 10-foot pole at this point. It's just not worth it. As a developer, with a tool is integral and foundational is the database. Not being able to poke at the internals when something's going wrong, or be able to look at it and understand why the performance isn't where it's supposed to be, but everything just being a black box. I mean, it just takes me back to the nightmare days of Microsoft software not doing what you wanted, or there were some other interesting things I've used over the years where it felt like a black box, and you just try like a monkey everything you possibly can try, and maybe you stumble on the right solution. Whereas if you could refer to the code, I know this doesn't apply to everyone, but for me personally, that's always been a sort of the gold standard. So I wouldn't be comfortable developing a database that wasn't open source. And from a business perspective, and this is something I've really learned a lot about over the last 5 years. I think for go-to-market for a database technology, open source is it's really a marketing strategy, and it's a very important one. It's very successful. Both because most of the users out there that could become potential customers or users, they're more interested in open source. It's just a friendlier, more enticing, packaging for some of the reasons I was just describing. But also, as a business, having an open source product, there's an information asymmetry that's very important. With open source, you don't have to take limited resources and target them at what your best hypothesis is for the companies that are going to buy your software. Instead, what you do is you early on get this thing out there, and you get to talk about it, and people are interested because it's open source, and you start getting little green shoots that pop up. Oh, here's a vertical that seems to be interested in it. Here's a use case we never thought of. People seem to be really interested in this particular aspect of the product and not that. And because you have so much sort of interest that's organic, you have a big advantage in terms of how you're going to steer your product direction and where you're going to apply those early sales and marketing efforts to get the most sort of leverage.
And do you have much of a community around the project? Do you accept patches or pull requests or anything like that from external sources?
We definitely do. We have a history of hiring the people that do the most contributions. So most of them become core contributors, or most core contributors become Cockroach employees over time. I think our biggest community contributors are often customers, some that aren't paying us, and others that are. And it's employees there that are working on features that they need that aren't necessarily on our roadmap. And we do make every effort to review those and incorporate them. Certainly, things like bug fixes come in very quickly. There are other kinds of changes to Cockroach that can take longer and be more difficult to fit in if they complicate the product in some way that's difficult for us to put into our roadmap. So it's a tension, and it's a balance that we strive to achieve, which is between the exigencies and the speed at which we can move as a business, and everything that everyone out there in the community might want to put into Cockroach. But the beauty of it, of course, is it's open source, so you can fork it and do your own thing if you want to work on something really kind of off brand or off the roadmap for us, where it wouldn't be the right thing. If you want to take Cockroach and add some really big capability to it that's fundamentally going to change it, you can do that. And that's I think another reason that people are interested in open source.
Yeah, I mean, it's that's really nice to hear you said it, obviously, because on a show like this, you'd expect us to be obviously 100% behind that kind of philosophy, if you like. So I do want to take a minute right now just to thank one of our sponsors. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by NetScout, accelerating innovation and operational agility that can meet the demands of today's digital world starts with a bold new IT strategy. As the pace of change continues to exponentially increase, so too does the risk of failure, raising the stakes for CIOs, architects, and IT operations. Simply put, digital transformation has changed the game. But NetScout has a different perspective, one that was built for the era of digital and data center transformation. It's called Visibility Without Borders. This real-time visibility extends to wherever your technology infrastructure and business applications reside. As the world leader in transforming packet data, NetScout Smart Data delivers high resolution and continuous monitoring across any network, data center, cloud, 5G, and more. Already in use monitoring and securing some of the world's most critical commercial and public service infrastructures, NetScout's next generation level of visibility provides the holistic perspective that IT teams are seeking. See more at netscout.com. That's NETSCOUT.com. And we thank NetScout for their support of FLOSS Weekly. And with that, I think I should see if Randal's got any more questions. Randal, you got some more questions for us?
I do indeed. So what's the license for this?
So that's actually a pretty interesting question that has evolved in the recent past. So we started off as Apache, and all of the releases that we've done of the sort of core product have been Apache for the last 4.5 years. The next release we do is going to be something called the Business Source License, or BSL, and I'll get into that for a second in a second. But I also want to cover another complication of the licensing story, which is very important to the business. So we're what's called an open core company. So there's an open source core. It's a very capable product. Most of what we've talked about is covered by the core. It's the scalable, SQL database with a cost-based sort of cutting-edge optimizer. It does the sort of self-healing and repair. It doesn't have any limits on the scalability. It's a fairly powerful product that looks pretty much like Google Spanner. That is all covered by the Apache license. But the open core model also encompasses additional enterprise functionality. And what we've always tried to do is, if something's going to be enterprise, it's not something that a small business needs to succeed or a startup. It's something that once you've already succeeded at a business, you typically, would come to rely on or need. And that sort of helps, make sure that customers that should be paying us and that can pay us are paying us. So we have, there's a distributed incremental backup and restore capability. There's geo-partitioning, which kind of helps support these global architectures. There's role-based access control and encryption at rest. Those are some examples of enterprise functionality. Recently, there's been some, say, upheavals in the open source, especially commercial open source landscape, and wasn't necessarily all precipitated by, but nevertheless, Amazon seems to be the company that is behind a lot of the disruption through their practice of taking open source products and providing them as services to their customers on AWS. And there's really nothing wrong with Amazon doing that. It's completely legitimate, for all of these sort of traditional open source licenses, and nor do I think it's immoral or anything like that on Amazon's part. I mean, it sure sucks for companies like ours that contemplated that this open core model would work well forever, and we were very comfortable with it. But Amazon sort of changed the reality. They found something where they could gain a big efficiency, use this open source software and monetize it effectively under the rubric of AWS. Provide a huge benefit to their users in terms of keeping costs low because they don't have to implement the technology themselves, and of course provide familiar APIs because they're actually using the open source technologies that have already been well adopted. Unfortunately, it is people have called it strip mining, that practice, and it's been very harmful to companies like Elastic, like Confluent, like Redis. And potentially like Cockroach. Amazon doesn't offer Cockroach as a product yet. Some of the capabilities that we have, especially around global databases, is something that Amazon talks a lot about in their marketing, and I think are quite far behind in terms of technology. So we grew pretty concerned after Amazon recently kind of took their efforts around monetizing open source in it's called a more aggressive, fundamentally more aggressive direction. What they ended up doing is re-implementing some of what Elastic had built into Elasticsearch as an enterprise feature around security, as additional new open source code. And they had a new distribution for Elastic. And so they're fundamentally, at this point, undermining Elastic's business model. So that was a wake-up call, I think, to the whole industry, and many people have been changing their licensing. And there's lots of different ways to do it. What we decided to do is to adopt a different license, something that was originally pioneered by a company called MariaDB. And what the business source license does is it's effectively Apache. There's one exclusion, and you can kind of it's kind of when you take this license, there's a couple things that you fill in order to make it functional. One is a term for how long the BSL governs the source code, and then another is what are the exclusions. So you use it as open source with some set of exclusions. So let me explain it. The business source license is kind of like a patent protection. So these exclusions, they're in effect for some number of years, and then the underlying source code that's licensed with the BSL reverts to a open source license of your choice. So ours is Apache. So the way it works for Cockroach in the next release we do, which is going to be in October, and that's going to be the 19.2 release of Cockroach, is that will be released under the BSL with some restrictions. 3 years after that, it will become Apache. So the nice thing about this license is you leave complete open source as a legacy as you go. But for 3 years, we get some protections. And you can outline what those protections are when you set up the license. Ours are very unrestricted, with one exception. And that is that you can't offer Cockroach commercially to external parties as a service. And you can't offer it directly as a service. So one way to think of it is it's essentially the Amazon exclusion. So we wanted to prevent Amazon from taking Cockroach and creating a global RDS offering with it directly. In other words, just essentially undermining our business model. But on the other hand, this BSL does allow all of our existing users to continue using exactly the way they would. The source code's all available. In fact, the source code for everything, including the enterprise features, is available. You can fork it. You can resell Cockroach, as a shrink wrap piece of software, or offer support for it. You can modify anything you'd like and recontribute it. So the intent behind most of what the open source intent is preserved. With this just one exclusion that you can't create essentially an RDS version of Cockroach for 3 years.
Okay, I've got two different directions of questions I'm going to ask you about this then. So why do you care if Amazon hosts it or not? Are you also offering a hosting product and that they be competing?
Yeah, we do. It's called Cockroach Cloud. And that is something we released last October. But even if we hadn't done that yet, we would certainly envision that for the future. It seems pretty clear that one of the genius things Amazon's done is really pioneered the software as a service, especially the infrastructure as a service, sort of product categories. And their database is very high margin and very successful. And it seems pretty clear to me that for the same reason people don't want to operate their own data centers anymore. They increasingly don't want to operate major pieces of infrastructure, especially as they become considerably more complex when you talk about something like a geo-distributed database. So, even if we didn't have that product yet, we would certainly envision it. And in some ways, this is a prophylactic measure, anticipating future competitive pressure from Amazon. But it's one of those things where it only works if you do it now. If you wait to do it when they've already, created an alternative in a global RDS offering, for example, the ability to use the BSL would be significantly reduced, because they would still be able to use the most recent Apache version, which, if we start the BSL now, then the version we release in October won't be available for Amazon to use until 3 years from October. So you got to get the clock started.
And also, I always question a little bit the point behind open core. I mean, Red Hat's products are open source top to bottom, and they make their money other ways. Why can't you do that with Cockroach?
Well, many companies have tried, exactly following Red Hat's footsteps. Can we build a business around pure open source software by offering support, for example, professional services? Many companies have failed, many. Very few have replicated Red Hat's success. And in fact, Red Hat is not pure open source from top to bottom. My understanding is that many of their more recent acquisitions do contemplate open core business models or were open core business models, and they just sort of maybe operating as, sort of independent, subsidiaries of Red Hat. So I think that if things would have been different, if that had been a viable business model, I don't think we would have gotten funded as a company if we had tried to say we were only going to offer support and services. That was certainly the prevailing viewpoint 5 years ago amongst the open source world. Nowadays, I'll tell you, I mean, open source was seen as a business catalyst, a significant business catalyst 5 years ago. Now it's the cloud, right? So that's another legacy of Amazon, and that's, I think, a very good example of what Amazon's doing. They're showing how things can be done significantly more efficiently for businesses. So the whole argument around open source seems to be, less top of mind for many developers. I think people really want source code to be available, and they want, fairly permissive rights to do things with it. But it's not the religious war that it might have been certainly 10 years ago, but even 5 years ago. I think now most developers are looking at software in terms of like how quickly can it be used to implement value. And that's certainly what investors are looking for as well. And I think the cloud offers, the sort of cloud infrastructure and software as a service is offered in the cloud, offers a very compelling answer to the question of how can you most quickly catalyze business value.
So if I can be blunt for a second, it sounds like your investors are actually pulling the strings now and are forcing it to be further and further away from an actual open source project. And that disappoints me.
Well, it is disappointing. It's disappointing to me as well. I would not characterize them as pulling the strings. We very much want to provide, a viable business that can continue to make Cockroach a reality. I mean, that was the reason that we raised money in the first place. It would have been, probably not possible for Cockroach as an open source project to ever rise to the level of sophistication that it's at already. And it's only been, 4.5 years as a business if we hadn't taken investment. When you take investment, you take it so that you can hire the world's best developers. When you hire the world's best developers, you give them equity with the promise that they're going to create value that's going to help them live their lives and raise their families and buy houses. And when I started this, it was purely about creating a database, the database I wanted to use. And of course, it has insensibly expanded into a lot more concerns around the employees and around the investors and the people that trust you to build a viable business. just sort of sticking your head in the sand means that the advanced and accelerated development that's happening on Cockroach right now wouldn't happen. So it's fundamentally a balance in a changing ecosystem between building great open source software without being too religious about it, and that's the caveat here, and being able to build it, being able to continue to build it, right? And that's, if we could just, have 50 developers working on Cockroach for free, and we wouldn't have to worry about this. But unfortunately, that's a much more difficult, circumstance to arrange.
Okay, I'll get away from the tough questions now. Let's go back to technology and community for a second. So, is the source code for Cockroach, is the GitHub actually active? Is that where you guys are pushing your commits as well?
Yeah, we do everything on GitHub. So all of our pull requests, all of our RFCs, our product prioritization. So it's all done in a very open, transparent fashion. So as I mentioned, all of the enterprise features as well are source available, and all of that's in the same GitHub repo.
Been around for a few years. Have you had pull requests? Have you had issues and things and solve those?
Oh yeah, there's quite a few issues. It's the nature of a complex system, but I think there's 50,000 pull requests that have gone through now, and it's a big project. It's been there since before the company existed.
So, is most of the work still being done by the inside employees, or are you getting a lot of contributions that are actually becoming significant now?
It's probably 90-95% inside employees.
Okay, and what's on the roadmap? What's coming up?
Well, there's some very technical stuff that is exciting, and it's around ways to further reduce geographic latencies, especially when you're doing sort of complex transactions between partitioned data. For example, a user initiating a transaction or an operation, in say Australia with, additional data involved, some of which might be in China and some of which might be in the UK. That's a really hard problem to solve, such that you're also providing serializable isolation guarantees, which is really the true ion acid. So that is there's been many things that we've added over the years. I think of it as sort of the special sauce of Cockroach to make those things work well and to work consistently well. And there's very exciting work being done, to further that aim. There's also pretty interesting things being done with vectorized execution. So this kind of takes Cockroach from being primarily an operational transactional database, so an OLTP product category, more into the hybrid transactional analytic processing. So starting to accommodate more complex queries over much vaster amounts of data. To do that efficiently, you both need to store the data in a more compact form so that aggregations are faster, and you also need to ship the data around and process it in a way that is more efficient. So we call it vectorized execution. I'm sure there's other ways to describe it, but that's something that's hitting this next release as well. And there's significant work that we're putting into really realizing the vision of making global applications very easy to build. I mentioned some of this earlier when I was talking about that, product capability of really partitioning data, for example, on a planetary scale. That's great. You can build amazing things with Cockroach the way it currently works, but it's not easy. It's not easy for the average developer, certainly. It's the sort of thing that a big multinational will use. It's a difficult thing to do for a startup because you need to run Cockroach in potentially 5 continents and 15 data centers with 15 different Kubernetes clusters and global DNS and load balancers regionally. It's a pretty complex problem. And so what we're realizing is that there's a future that, especially enabled by technologies like serverless, things like Lambda and Google Cloud Functions, that will pair nicely with a serverless version of Cockroach that's run in the cloud that will allow developers to spin up global applications, like truly global. And they can do that in minutes, and they can do that paying only for what they use. And what they're actually developing to the end delivering to the end customers is an incredible value proposition, which is both that the end customer is going to have the assurance that their data is being processed in their legal jurisdiction, no matter where they are, and that they're going to be able to deliver an instantaneous user experience. So less than 100 milliseconds, which is the threshold for a human to experience something as being instantaneous. 100 milliseconds. So you click a button on your mobile app. Are you going to be able to send that up into the cloud through the mobile networks, into the backbone, hit the application server and some data center, talk to the underlying database, and then make its way all the way back? Can you do that in less than 100 milliseconds? If you can deliver something that feels instantaneous to the end user. And the reality is that these things are possible now. And once applications start to embrace that, once you start to feel what it is like to have an instantaneous user experience as opposed to something that takes a couple seconds, which everyone's used to right now, apps that don't do that are going to feel antique. So that's the future we're driving for, and that's sort of the slightly longer term horizon. So we really want to move the sort of state of the art forward in that direction. And fundamentally, that's what Cockroach has always been built for. And it's just it's as I mentioned before, the metaphor. There's a big mountain that we're climbing, but it's very exciting.
Cool. And Eric Duckman asked the usual joke question that we have. When will it support blockchain?
Well, it's open source, so maybe someone will put it in there. We don't have any plans to do anything with blockchain. It's I think people conflate that with databases too frequently, and doesn't have much to do with what we're doing.
It's also part of our drinking game. So whenever we mention blockchain on this show, there are people that reach for a glass. So that,
I hope I saved a lot of people a shot of vodka.
And I'm not really supposed to talk about alcohol on the show, so just pretend I never said that. Anyway, we're almost out of time. I have 3 questions to ask. The first one's a little tough because you have to do set arithmetic. Is there anything you wanted to talk about on this show that we didn't get to?
I think we got to most of what I thought was important to cover. Okay. So
that's always the most. It's a puzzling question because you have to take everything that you wanted to talk about and everything we actually talked about, then do the set math between the two. It's a tough question to do. Okay, and I have 2 final questions. One is, what is your favorite text editor?
Emacs.
Yay! I gotta win. All right. and what's your favorite scripting language?
Probably Python.
Well, 1 out of 2 is not bad, and usually it's the other way around. So usually it's it's not. Usually it's neither. So that's kind of cool. Hey, Spencer, it's been great having you on the show. I'm actually excited about what CockroachDB is claiming to do, and I will look further into it. Maybe spin up an instance or 2 and see what that looks like. It looks like you've got a Docker image, which makes it much simpler for installation and stuff. So I look forward to this, and thank you for coming on the show.
It was my pleasure, Randall. Thanks.
Great. That was Spencer Kimball, who is the co-founder and CEO of Cockroach Labs, doing the CockroachDB. That was really interesting. What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, it is a really interesting project. I think the point that Spencer was making when I was saying about this distribution, this kind of extreme distribution, if you like, across continents and stuff, could cause massive problems. It was interesting the way he was able to kind of flip that as well and say, well, it can actually be useful if you need to distribute your data around the world, as many large enterprises would do. It does seem very enterprise focused to me, which is fine. That's their business model and all that. I don't know if it would be as popular in, I don't know, academics and other things, maybe, the kind of non-enterprise world. I'm not sure, but very interesting project, yeah.
Awesome, yeah. And the idea of having an ACID-compliant distributed database is still pretty bizarre to me. So, I mean, and how do you, wow, I mean, and rewriting Postgres in Go, that's got to be a bizarre set of things to do. So I wonder just how effective that is and how compatible it actually is. By the way, all the way through the show, you've heard the dogs. We've had the dogs occasionally on this show. And they once they start barking, they bark all day. The best part is that there was some construction going on upstairs just as we were about to start taping the show. And luckily, they didn't come back because it's really noisy when they do the construction upstairs. So that's really crazy. So let's talk about who's coming up. Who's coming up next week? I bet you recognize the person who's going to be co-hosting on that show. Simon and you. Is that, that's not even English, is it? Simon, right.
Simon and I? No, it would be Simon and I if I was saying it. yeah, we're both English speakers. Yes, Simon and I will be here next week talking about OggCamp, an open source event. I won't talk too much about it now because we've got a whole show to do that next time.
Exactly. Yeah, don't give away the ending. And just added to the list, GNOME. I can't believe I haven't had a show on GNOME yet. Oh. Is that where I pronounce that? It's hard G, right? GNOME?
Yeah, GNOME, yeah.
Okay, so we're going to have, I forget who I've got on there, but it is somebody apparently is important on their project because that's who sent it. Neil McGovern. So hopefully he's like one of the senior guys there. He's been around for a while. His name was proffered about a year ago, and I've been mailing him about every quarter to get him on. And finally he said, sure, whatever, let's do it. So that's great. And that's all we have on the schedule right now. 2 more shows, which is what we had last week, 2 more shows. So if I can at least stay 2 shows ahead, I'm probably okay. Go to twit.tv/floss, which is the homepage for this show. And linked from there is the big spreadsheet, which is the upcoming guests and who I'm working on and who I'm chatting with and a lot of empty slots. So please, I beg of you guys are all an open source project at some point, somewhere, or you wouldn't be listening to this show. I mean, you're probably doing open source. Please talk to your project leader or community coordinator and have them email me, merlin@stonehenge.com. I really want to fill at least another couple slots before next week's show. So I'm a little short. I've sent out like 10 mails and stuff. I've been, and Reverb Mike in the chat room says, sounding better this week, just barely, and it's only because I'm not using my show voice, which actually we discovered during the opening of the taping that when I used my show voice, so I was almost whispering. It was almost ASMR, which is really crazy. Anyway, please go there, see who I'm working on. If you know contacts from some of the projects that are further down, please send me the email or email them and say, Randal would like to have you on the show. We do a live stream at 9:30 p.m. Oh, what the heck? 9:30 a.m. Pacific. I never missed that. That's because I saw Pacific and I went to pee, right? Well, I didn't go to pee. I'm still here. This is rapidly sliding down. 9:30 a.m. Pacific on Wednesdays at live.twit.tv. You can watch us behind this show and see what we're doing. We have follow us at Floss Weekly on Twitter. I'm not using that much, and it no longer auto-propagates from our G+ because that's gone. You can follow me at Merlin, MERLYN on Twitter. The only thing I have to plug, I've got a couple things to plug. I'm going to be at All Things Open in mid-October, which is right around the corner, about a month from now. So if you're in Raleigh, North Carolina, and you're going to go to the show, you can definitely see me there. I'm going to be running around. There are 40 tracks, so it's obviously very difficult to get that to happen. I mean, it's like there's usually like 6 things I want to go see at the same time. So it's a really well-run show, 5,000 attendees, and it's just been great. And we had the main guy. I forget his name. Sorry, he's gonna be mad now. He's never going to invite me back. But if you go to register, if you type Floss Weekly in all lowercase in the discount box, you can get it at the minimum rate, which I believe is $99 for the whole shows. So that's kind of cool. We do have a winner finally in the Find the Magnet. Let's see if I can point to it. No, this way. Find the Magnet That Moved. It is this one right here in the lower right corner, and it's by a guy that goes by name. I don't know that's a guy. Somebody named Hutch. So we do have a winner, and that was the only magnet that was moved, but that we finally had a winner in the last week. So that's pretty cool. Anything you want to plug there, Dan?
No, not really. Apart from everyone should tune in next week and come back to find out why they should know more about OggCamp and check me out at danlynch.org if you want to know what I'm up to.
Right. And I apologize for my throat, and I apologize for the dogs. But otherwise, I think this show worked pretty well. I was kind of happy with it. So all I need is some more guests. So please, people, contact your community coordinator or project leader and have them email me, merlin@stonehenge.com. My email address is on twit.tv/floss homepage, so you don't have to write that down. It's all there. So anyway, Dan, thanks once again for jumping in and being on the other side of the mic there for me.
No problem.
Great. And we'll see you all again next week on Floss Weekly.